They said I would never have the courage to do what I did last Thursday. Western media dismissed me as just another African leader making noise. Israeli intelligence thought I was a young soldier playing politics. Even some of my own advisors whispered that I was moving too fast, too hard, too dangerously. They were all wrong, because while they were busy underestimating me, I was dismantling their entire shadow network across Africa. And what I'm about to tell you isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's the blueprint for how Africa finally stops being the world's playground. My name is Ibrahim Traoré, and this is the story of how I declared war on Benjamin Netanyahu's hidden African empire. For the past 15 years, while African leaders signed development deals and smiled for photo ops, Netanyahu was building something else entirely, a spider web of intelligence operations, data harvesting companies, and surveillance networks stretching from Lagos to Nairobi. They thought we were too poor to notice, too divided to resist, too desperate to say no. But I noticed everything. What really triggered last Thursday's operation? 3 weeks ago, my intelligence chief walked into my office with a folder. Inside were communication intercepts, financial records, and satellite imagery that made my blood run cold. Israeli-backed companies weren't just doing business in Burkina Faso. They were mapping our mineral deposits with military precision, recording our political meetings through compromised telecommunications, tracking the movement of our citizens with facial recognition systems we never approved. And the worst part, this intelligence was being shared with multinational corporations to squeeze better deals from African governments. Our own data was being used to exploit us more efficiently. That night I didn't sleep. At dawn, I made my decision. At 5 a.m., I called my commanders. Operation Clear Sight begins in 2 hours. No leaks, no delays, no mercy. At exactly 7 a.m., while most of Ouagadougou was still waking up, my forces moved on 17 different targets across the city. The first location looked like a normal office building. But inside, my soldiers found servers powerful enough to monitor communications across half the continent. Hard drives with the personal data of over 2 million citizens. Encrypted phones with direct lines to Tel Aviv. And thousands of documents proving how our security had been systematically compromised. By 9 a.m., we had raided 6 more Israeli-linked operations. These weren't simple businesses. They were intelligence posts disguised as development agencies, tech companies, and humanitarian groups. At each site, we found the same thing: mass surveillance equipment, African data ready for export, and systems that bypassed our national security entirely. At noon, I went before the cameras and said what I had been preparing for months. Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are no longer your test subjects. And we are definitely no longer your blind spot. Those words weren't just for my people. They were a message to Benjamin Netanyahu himself. Within hours, the effect spread. Mali's president called me. Ibrahim, we found similar operations here. What do we do? Shut them down, I told him. Guinea's military leaders reached out, same story. By evening, 3 nations had frozen Israeli imports. 4 more were auditing foreign projects. And the African Union was quietly discussing something unthinkable until now: a continental strategy to counter foreign intelligence infiltration. But the real shock? The evidence showed Israel wasn't acting alone. France, Britain, even the United States had been sharing intelligence gathered on African soil. For decades, they treated Africa as a commodity, dividing intelligence among themselves like colonial spoils. The next morning, an Israeli diplomat demanded to know by what authority I acted. I answered, by the authority of a sovereign nation that refuses to be spied on. 2 days later, Netanyahu himself requested a private call. President Traore, he said, I think there's been a misunderstanding about our activities. I replied, the only misunderstanding was thinking we wouldn't notice. He tried to defend Israeli companies as development partners. I stopped him. When you build infrastructure that spies on the people it serves, that's not development. That's occupation with better marketing. The call lasted 12 minutes. He never called back. Their response came through propaganda. Israeli media called me reckless. European newspapers warned of my authoritarian tendencies. But young Africans no longer take their cues from foreign media. They see through the lies. That night, thousands gathered outside the presidential compound not to protest, but to celebrate. Signs read, "Our data, our choice." University students organized lectures on digital sovereignty. Even my critics admitted what we exposed had to be exposed. Soon, African leaders began sharing their own intelligence with me. What emerged was bigger than any one country. A continent-wide picture of surveillance, extraction, and deception. So we created something new, the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework. Its principles are simple. Full transparency for all foreign investments in telecommunications and data, zero tolerance for undeclared intelligence activities, cooperation across African nations in monitoring interference, and most importantly, African data stays in Africa. They called it unrealistic. They said we couldn't survive without their technology. But within 3 weeks, we had offers from China, Russia, India, and even some European companies willing to meet our standards. Turns out, plenty of partners can do business without spying on their customers. And the ripple effects spread. Nigeria required foreign companies to store data locally. Kenya began auditing all telecom partnerships. South Africa declared African infrastructure must serve African interests first. For the first time in decades, Africa is setting the terms instead of begging for them. This isn't anti-Western. This isn't anti-Israel. This is pro-African. We welcome all partners who respect sovereignty and transparency. We reject those who treat Africa as a target or a testing ground. 6 months later, Burkina Faso's digital infrastructure is stronger, faster, and more secure than ever before. Our people know their rights are protected. Our internet is cheaper, our networks safer, and our sovereignty intact. The lesson is clear. Technological independence isn't just possible, it's profitable. The era of African digital colonialism is ending. The question isn't whether the world will respect African digital sovereignty. The question is, how much will it cost them to learn the same lesson Benjamin Netanyahu already learned? Because one way or another, they will learn it. Africa chooses sovereignty. Africa chooses transparency. Africa chooses its own digital destiny.